Thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar, 5 Ways Board Software Can Stop Good Governance. My name is Diane Johnson, and I'm part of the marketing team at Diligent. Before we get started today, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar should last about 45 minutes. It will be recorded, and a replay will be sent out to everyone shortly after this session. Please feel free to share the replay with your colleagues. Also, lines will be muted to reduce the background noise. If you have any questions, feel free to use the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel at any time. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dottie Schindlinger and Joe Kaiser. Dottie is Diligent's Governance Technology Evangelist. In this role, she provides thought leadership on governance and technology topics for a variety of publications. She teaches dozens of webinars annually and presents both at conferences and in boardrooms to directors and executives globally. Joe is the Director of Product Content at Diligent. He's responsible for internal and external product education, technical documentation, and making sure Diligent products are clear and easy to understand. Now I'd like to hand things over to Dottie and Joe to take us through the rest of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Diane, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. Today, we're going to be spending a little bit of time to talk about some of the things that we've observed can happen as organizations and companies begin to use secure software with their boards that kind of run counter to good governance. And so we're going to dive in a little bit deep on some of the ways that this kind of technology can sort of be misused and abused, so to speak, and that kind of run counter to what you really would like the board to be able to accomplish. And so we're going to talk about some of those issues. We'll focus on 5 different areas. We'll provide a little background and context for that. And then I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Joe, who's sitting right here at my elbow. So Hello. This is like the radio talk show booth. And he's going to show some specific fixes that could really help you, particularly as you're using board software, some things to be aware of, things that you might want to review and adjust that can help to address the 5 areas that we're going to focus on. As we go through this, as Diane mentioned, we'd very much like to hear from you. Now, we do have all the phone lines muted, but the way to participate is simply to send us a question using the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. So we'll be queuing those up, and there'll be a couple of places throughout today's session that we'll stop and answer questions. So we hope that we'll see some questions coming from you as we get going here. So just to kind of provide a very brief high-level overview, I think it's helpful just to take a moment and think back to why did this software come into being in the first place? What was the point? So before we start to talk about how it can go right or wrong, what was the goal of using this kind of software in the first place? And I think it's helpful to just remind ourselves a little bit of the roots of this whole thing. Because there have been some very interesting changes over the number of years that the software has been around, and that's going, I think, to point to some of the things we're going to focus on today. So first of all, I think it's helpful to remember that this entire industry, which for a long time has been referred to as the board portal industry, although now, because there is so much going on and portal technology is a little antiquated, it's better to think of this as secure board software or secure governance management software. But the whole thing came into being really in the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley. So after the big scandals at Enron and WorldCom, there were a number of new regulations that came into being. I don't have to tell all of you on the phone about those. But things like changes to the Audit Committee, changes to financial reporting, changes to the level of accountability and transparency for the board really had people scrambling, trying to figure out how are we going to prove that we're in compliance. And so initially, this kind of software came into being to just try to help the corporate secretary and, to some extent, the CEO and the CFO prove that they were doing the things that they were being asked to do by regulators. Since that time, which is now going back, 17, 18 years, there's been quite a number of changes, and included in that would be a variety of different ways of approaching good governance and using software to support the good governance process. So across the industry, there's sort of a standard of a SaaS model product. So usually it's a subscription basis, usually is using some kind of secure cloud hosting. So the days of on-site hosting are really kind of over. The thinking being that, look, as we've seen with all the many, many hacks that get advertised every single week, you're no more secure using cloud than you are on-site or using vice versa. So really going with the cloud hosting means that you have the opportunity to be part of a larger stream of data that is being protected really 24/7, very intentionally and securely by an entire team that is thinking about managing that information. So most companies these days rely on that secure cloud hosting just to kind of also offload that liability onto someone else, you know, so you don't have to keep all that liability for yourself. But at the bottom line, this kind of software still has at its core the idea that it is purpose-built specifically to support the work of governance. So it is really designed around the way corporate secretaries and boards and senior officers and executives function when it comes to board work. It's all designed around supporting that. So things like just managing the meetings, you know, making sure that we can get the meeting scheduled and get the meeting materials out there, get the agendas posted, handle the minutes, handle voting, you know, handle communication leading up to the meeting, that sort of thing. And then, of course, just everything that goes into secure document creation and delivery. So you want to have a place where you can find all the stuff that you need to have at your fingertips, the bylaws, the past minutes, the reports, the financials, all of that stuff needs to be stored securely so that the right people get the right information at the right moment. And then, of course, having a way to provide feedback and even formal voting. And then maybe on from there, doing some board development work, things like our annual directors and officers questionnaires, or maybe our board self-assessment if we're required to do that by our exchange. Maybe just getting some basic feedback on things. And then finally, having a way to alert and message the directors in between meetings. So those are kind of common features of a lot of the software packages that are out there. Certainly for those of us that work here at Diligent, those are the kinds of things that we think about all the time. We're always trying to challenge ourselves to think about what other parts of the governance process could be and should be digitized. How could technology answer the needs of directors, of corporate secretaries, of general counsels, of other senior executives, and then really challenging ourselves to come up with solutions that will help to meet those needs. And most of the other companies that are in this space, really, we all kind of think that same way. We're trying very hard to find ways to meet the needs of the board and of the senior executives. At this stage of the game, Diligent has become the largest provider in the space. We now have over 340,000 users. The vast majority of that number are directors and senior officers, and then a much smaller percentage, about 10% or less, are administrators. So those would be your corporate secretaries and maybe assistant general counsels. They're represented by over 10,000 organizations worldwide, about 45% of the Fortune 1000, and representation in more than 70 countries. So, you know, it's definitely grown quite a bit. You can tell that, you know, this is something that I think is really here to stay. It kind of makes sense. I know Joe and I always talk with each other about, why did it take so long for this to happen? It seems kind of bizarre to us. Every other part of our enterprises has been completely digitized in every way. I mean, we don't make a decision without going to the data and looking at 3 websites. So it's really weird that it took this long for this to come into the boardroom. But, you know, it's now really kind of here to stay. But so with that as sort of a backdrop, understanding that, you know, at this point, more than half of all companies are using this kind of secure software to conduct their business affairs around the board, it's important to know that that can go well, and it can also go not so great. And so there are 5 ways that, you know, as Joe and I were talking about this session and sort of thinking it through, there are sort of 5 things that leapt out to both of us as kind of common hallmarks of ways that this software can be abused or maybe very unintentionally misused. And so we thought we'd kind of call attention to those 5. It's not to say that there's only 5, but these were sort of the 5 that leapt out at us as very common and maybe worth talking about on a webinar. So the first one, and we'll kind of do like a top 10 list or a top 5 list, we'll go backwards. So sort of the 5 most frequently experienced snafu, if you will, would be really mishandling document control. Now, in almost every system out there, and certainly in Diligent, there are a number of different ways that you can configure the platform to ensure that the right set of eyes gets the right document at the right time and in the right format. But those settings need to be really thought through. And what we've seen happen, and Joe will certainly provide some additional detail on this, is that those decisions might be made early on in the implementation of the software, and then maybe not reviewed regularly enough to make sure that they're still appropriate. And so that's something that really can go badly. And also, if those controls are not applied correctly, it can kind of have an impact on accountability. So for example, whether or not a director is allowed to download and print things can have a real implication on how secure that information is. So that's certainly a biggie. I think the next one, which is kind of related, but a little bit of a nuance there, would be that access controls and permissions haven't been applied correctly. So part one is really how do we handle the security of the documents? Part two is how do we really handle the right level of access for the people? So not every single person should have the same level of access to the system. You may have some individuals that work within the company that need to have much more administrator level access and the ability to change things, edit things, move things around. And you may have someone who is maybe kind of an external resource, maybe the independent auditor, or an external counsel who for a temporary period of time needs to have some access to the system, but maybe not a ton of access to the system. So thinking through exactly who can access what, those are very important decisions. And if they're not done right, can kind of weaken the security of the system overall. So that's another kind of important thing. And in particular, things like, making sure your password strength is good, and just some of the basic housekeeping can go badly. Number three is something that we've been talking a lot about, and I'm going to share some data here in just a moment around number three. But secure messaging might not be implemented fully. What we've learned through some of the research I'm going to show you in a moment is that there really is this tension between convenience on the part of the directors and the security of their communications with one another. And so sometimes what we're seeing is that even when a company tries to implement secure messaging and they roll that out, they don't then take the extra step to make sure to reinforce its usage consistently, or to provide a set of standards and protocols that everyone must follow. And what that can do is, in fact, invite some security gaps and potential leaks. So those are three of the top ones. The next two relate to both of those, right? So if we think about, bad settings, bad usage of document security, bad secure messaging usage or implementation, that relates very much to number two, which is that the directors really haven't been given the specific set of guidelines, support, training, and maybe even oversight to make sure that they are actually doing everything appropriately. And we know how challenging that is. I mean, every director I know, including myself, serves on more than one board, and I know what a hassle it is to have 17 different ways to find information, and I've always got to be scrambling around to find things. But I also recognize how important it is to follow the protocols for each specific company, because otherwise that company really struggles to maintain the integrity of their security standards. And so, that's another sort of aspect of this, is just how do we manage the people involved and make sure that they are getting the level of support and training that they need. And then finally, and this one is kind of a biggie, the technology evolves over time. It's constantly changing. I know here at Diligent, we probably push a release a week, every other week, something like that. And sometimes these are just little patches or, small updates, but sometimes they're big new features. And, it really behooves you to take the time to go back every once in a while, maybe once a year, and, read through a couple of the guides or talk to your customer service rep and find out, hey, what am I not using in this system? What are some of the other opportunities that this system provides me that I'm not leveraging and that maybe would be material to the way that we're trying to function as a company? So those are really the ones that we're going to focus on. What I'd like to do is share with you a little bit of the research. So we did some research earlier this year. This was sort of towards the beginning of the year. We did a research report with the New York Stock Exchange, and through their governance services unit, we did a survey of public company directors, about 381 that responded. And what we really wanted to find out through this survey were about the communication practices and level of cyber risk understanding on the part of the directors. What was sort of interesting about this particular work is that, there have been a number of surveys like this out there. I've certainly read probably 10 of them this year that ask very similar questions. The kinds of questions they ask are of directors, how secure do you feel the company is, and how well do you feel your company is doing on its cybersecurity programs? And when those directors are asked those kinds of opinion questions, the results come in fairly good. They come in fairly high. They say, you know what, we're doing a lot. Management's really all over this. Our CIO is doing a great job. We're doing well. And that's great. And I'm certain that they believe that, and probably they should believe that, because probably their CIOs and their senior management is doing a lot around cybersecurity. At least I hope they are. Well, what was interesting with this survey was that we asked some different questions. We wanted to ask different kinds of things like, what methods do you use to communicate and how frequently do you use those methods? And how effective are those communications that you're receiving from the company? What do you feel about them? How much do you pay attention to them? Do you feel that it's too much information, not enough information? Is it timely, and so on? We wanted to know how aware are you of the risks inherent in different ways that you might communicate? So we asked some questions that help us understand and assess their level of understanding around risk. And then finally, what are some of the controls that you have in place? So what's interesting about this survey is that we really were asking them to not give us their opinion, but to report their actual behaviors. And since we're asking about their behaviors, they were sort of, do you do this or not? And it was kind of like a yes, no. Or which of these items on this list do you ever use and how frequently? And it gave us kind of a different picture. And it speaks a little bit to some of the things that we identified as gaps or areas that this kind of software can be misused. One of which was we asked a question about how often do you download board books onto personal devices or computers? And just a little less than half say that's a common practice. And so that one really surprised us because we asked a different question earlier, which was, do you use a secure board management platform? And 84% of the respondents said they do. So what's interesting is, so even though 84%, so the vast majority are using secure software, you still have half of the directors downloading things onto personal devices. Now, one of the things I will say is we don't really know from this result whether or not they're kind of doing that outside the firewall or within the firewall, but what we know from other results, which you'll see in just a moment, is we sort of have a suspicion this is mostly outside the firewall. And you can imagine why that might happen, right? If I'm a director and I am going to be in London on Monday, and then I've got to go to, Paris on Tuesday, and then I've got to fly back to LA on Wednesday, I'm going to want to just put that thing offline on whatever device I'm going to be able to use on the plane and just go. But the reality is that most secure board platforms offer offline capabilities. And so there really is kind of no compelling argument to make that this is a good idea because for lots of reasons, not the least of which is, it's now outside of the control of the security system. It's also outside the control of the corporate secretary. So in the event of any type of e-discovery or litigation hold, they're going to have to ask directors to turn over their devices, which is not an awesome thing to ask. So that was kind of interesting. We also then wanted to know, okay, well, maybe this is happening because there's not been a lot of standards put in place around security. So we asked the question, has your board ever conducted a security audit of its communication practices? We thought maybe there'd been an audit at some point and everybody had agreed this level of risk was tolerable for us and we were okay with it. But 40% came back and told us, we don't even know what that means. What's a security audit? I don't think anything like that has ever happened. Interestingly, another 28% on top of this 40 said management sees to this, which was a fascinating response because if it's a security audit of the board's communication practices, the board would have to be involved. It couldn't be something management could do without their complicit involvement. And one of the responses we had in there, we had a number of responses that said, yes, and here's how we did it, or yes, we do it every 2 years, or yes, we've done it once in the last 5. But these were by far the most common answers. It was no, have no idea, or 28%, yes, someone else handles this. So clearly there's a little bit of a disconnect there in terms of whether or not they're getting the right level of oversight. Then the next thing we wanted to know was about what methods they use to communicate. Now, there was a whole list of different kinds of communication options. Obviously 100% of the respondents said face-to-face meetings, which is almost like a little trick question. We wanted to see if they were actually paying attention and answering the survey. But the next most common way that they communicate beyond face-to-face meetings at 92% is personal email. This one literally scares the pants off me because we know from other surveys that we've done and certainly have read and participated in that the vast majority of personal email accounts are in Gmail, Yahoo Mail, AOL, and these are all systems that have at one point or another been hacked. We also know from a lot of the research that's coming out of the FBI and other places that directors and officers of companies are the prime targets of bad actors. And let's figure out why that is. It's pretty obvious. These are people that have access to really good data, data that would fetch a nice price on the dark web and would be very attractive to bad actors. And they tend to get the least amount of oversight. They tend to be the ones that, nobody really kind of is in charge of making sure that they're following corporate communication policies around security. And they sort of get a little bit of a pass. I can tell you from my own experience how many times I've worked with boards where there's been a comment of, well, we just don't want them to ever have to change their passwords because that's a major hassle and they'll never do it. And yet, here's this concern, right? But they're also the ones most at risk. So we have this kind of disconnect between the level of risk that they actually are under and the level of security that they are adhering to and the level of support and coaching and oversight that they're receiving to make sure that they're maintaining secure communication. And just to give you a little bit of a sense, these are some of the more recent headlines regarding email-specific attacks that are targeted to officers and directors. Perhaps maybe one of the most famous ones, which hopefully probably everyone on the phone has heard of, just about 18 months ago or so, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who serves as a director of Salesforce, was emailing a slide deck, I think it was like a 91-slide slide deck, to a colleague on that board out of his personal email in advance of the Salesforce meeting. And that email was hacked. And that entire slide deck was then loaded up onto a website called DC Leaks. It's kind of like a WikiLeaks for the District of Columbia. It got posted on there about an hour after it was hacked from his email. It then ended up on the Wall Street Journal the very next morning. And that impacted the entire, in that slide deck were all of Salesforce's acquisition targets for the next 18 months. They had to completely change their strategy because almost 6 months prior, or actually, excuse me, almost 6 weeks prior to the board meeting, all of their acquisition targets had now shown up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So, I mean, look, we're not kind of trying to be fear mongers or anything like that, but it's really kind of acknowledging something that is true, which is that our directors, they need a bit more support. I can say that as a director, I feel like I need a bit more oversight and support. I need to make sure that, I'm not inadvertently and totally unintentionally creating risk for the company that I serve just because I race from one plane to the other, which Joe can tell you I do every week. So it's really important to make sure that we're getting the kind of support that we need. What's interesting is we asked a question about whether or not the board has IT involvement in sanctioning the kind of communication methods that they use. And what we found was that really of the people that might sanction how the board communicates, only 8% said that it was the data security team or the IS team. That's kind of interesting. Now, that number goes way up when we ask the question, who administers the software? So the IT team often is very involved in administering the software over time, but they're clearly not seen as having any sort of authority over the software. We think that might be something worth investigating. When it comes to data security, that is in their wheelhouse, and it might really behoove the board and the security team to be in a little bit closer collaboration, having a bit more oversight and a bit more insight into what the board is doing. We know, we know this is an issue because when we asked, does the board go through any cybersecurity training, 62% said no. Of the 22%, I believe it was, that said that they do receive some cybersecurity training, they told us that they had only ever had to do it one time, not once a year, once. And we don't know once in what time horizon. Might have been 5 years, might have been 10 years, we don't know. But given how quickly, the different threats change and given how quickly the tactics change, once is not enough, never is certainly not enough. So giving them some training is incredibly important. So just to kind of quickly recap, these were the top 5. So document control, access controls and permissions, secure messaging, appropriate support and oversight, and then just really making sure that the technology is being used the way that it should be to streamline governance. I'm going to pause here for just a moment and see if we've got some questions from our audience, and then I'm going to hand the reins over to Joe. So we have any questions, Joe?
Yeah, thank you, Dottie, for that. I think that was a great encapsulation of some of the issues that can arise when boards start implementing software in their environments. We do have a couple of questions here. So do you think the usage of technology at this kind of director level, governance level, do you think that it's outpacing concerns about the risk of using that technology?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah. So, yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that the directors are using lots of technology, right? It's not to say that directors are technology phobes. I think it's far, far, far from it. I think it's more so just that they are serving on many different boards, and they may also be the CEO of a company, and they may be on some nonprofit boards, and they've got a lot going on. And so I think partly what happens is this pull for convenience kind of trumps the amount of care and feeding they put into security. So, look, I think that it is outpacing a little bit. I think their use of technology is outpacing the security. I know a lot of directors that will remain unnamed because they're delightful people, but I'm a little horrified to say that they just basically use the same password for every single system that they use. And you can imagine why that would happen, because they'd probably use 15 different systems a day. But at the same time, having that level of risk, so if that password gets lost one time, that bad actor has access to anything the director uses. It's just an unacceptable level of risk in my mind. So I think the concern does need to be raised.
Yeah, and I think that that's the case whether you're a director or not, right? Like everyone has this issue where there's too many accounts.
Absolutely.
Password, but the level of risk goes up as you're in control of more of this kind of important information.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, and I think too, systems like Diligent, which has biometrics, so you can just use your thumbprint to log in or your fingerprint to log in. That takes some of the sting out of having to change the password all the time. I mean, even if the password has to change, you still are using your biometrics, and so your biometrics are what they are. And I think that just makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, and I'm going to get a little bit more into the technology that goes into that a little bit later on. Just to go back to some of the questions that are coming in, I think we all find the results of the survey you presented a little bit frightening, alarming, especially what I found particularly troubling was the lack of security oversight.
Yep.
So why do you think there isn't more urgency for kind of this issue to be tackled?
It's a great question. Look, I think there's a lot of reasons why it can seem really hard to do this work. I think first and foremost, look, our directors are incredibly busy, very high profile, extremely important people, very smart people. And so, I think that we often want to make sure that they're being taken care of, right? We want to make sure that they're having a good experience. Here, we're going to move the phone for just a second to get a little closer.
All right, that should be good.
Yeah. But I think that, having that sort of understanding that they are important people that are extremely busy, they also understand very keenly what their jobs are. As your director, they know that one of their most important jobs is to make sure that the company's level of risk is tolerable, mitigated, and managed as much as possible. And so it seems very counterintuitive to me that that you wouldn't give them the tools to help them on the cyber front. If you're not giving them the tools to make sure that they themselves don't represent a huge level of risk, that's just a big oversight in my mind. So I think there's a bit of inertia around, we don't want to put more burden on our directors. And from the director's perspective, there's a bit of inertia around, we don't want to have to learn 17 new things and carry around more devices. But I think it's just a good, frank conversation about what that in fact means. If you make those kinds of decisions, it's not just, make those decisions very intentionally and transparently, and not just by default because you don't want to have the conversation. I think that's what I would suggest.
Absolutely, right. There's always the idea that if something has worked in the past, well, why change it? But I think that you do have to readdress these things continuously before it becomes a crisis, right? I mean, these threats are always evolving.
Yep.
We do have one more question here.
All right.
Does Diligent have a best practices document that could be helpful in instructing board members on how to access board materials?
Yeah, well, we actually have a number of those. I mean, well, first and foremost, I would definitely suggest taking a look at this report that I've been referencing from the New York Stock Exchange, and we'll make sure when we send out the slides to include a link to that report so that if it's of interest, we'd encourage you to share it with your board members. Now, obviously, it's not super Diligent specific because we were doing the research in conjunction with a partner, but we do provide some specific recommendations to board members in that report. But Diligent also has a number of really good resources.
We certainly do, yeah. I'm happy to field that. Yeah, we certainly have a number of resources around best practices. We make best practice recommendations in many of our onboarding documents when we bring new clients on, and as those change, we of course come back to you as well through our customer success team. We also try to build these best practices into the product itself and into the services we provide. So hopefully it becomes a little bit more invisible than sending out a document and having you read it.
Great.
But we're always thinking about this stuff going forward.
That's awesome. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Joe now, and he's going to spend a little bit of time talking in some more detail about the ways that you could hopefully fix some of these issues. So go ahead and take it away, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Dottie. We're always thinking about these issues internally, right? Because we have to kind of flow these solutions into our products and into the services that we provide. And so for these 5 scenarios that were described, we kind of broke it down into kind of 5 broad fixes. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of fixes that we've implemented to some of these issues in some of our products. So the first thing that I want to talk about is document control. And this is crosses a few different areas. Primarily, you want to think about who has access to these documents. And I think that kind of happens naturally, you know, as the kind of makeup of the board changes and people come off and on. You do kind of look at that organically, make those changes, and that's not so much of an issue, but it's only part of the process. The other things that you have to consider include what kind of access do these people have, and what kind of risks does that open up depending on the ways they can use these documents. So I want to talk about one example that we've provided in Diligent Boards.
Oh, so here, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so one solution that we have implemented in Diligent Boards, and this is just one of a few things that we do, is that we've implemented watermarking kind of at every level of how you could access the document. So if a person has access, whether they have print access, export access, and you can disable that access as well if you need that level of control. Or even if they're just viewing it on screen, we can apply a watermark to every single page that really adds accountability to this document control workflow, right? So on every page, it's going to have the name of the person who's looking at the document at the time that they're looking at it, and any other additional information that you want to provide. So if this document is ever printed, if it's exported, or even if something you might not consider, if it's taken with a screenshot and just pulled out of the portal that way, if it leaves our secure envelope, you would always be able to kind of go backwards, start this kind of audit trail at the beginning at where this was extracted. So that really gives you that level of accountability in the document control process. That's kind of how we think about this process going forward. So the next thing that I want to talk about is regarding permission settings and control, and making sure that that is also an ongoing conversation, and making sure that you really have a granular level of control there. We do offer an extremely granular level of who has access to what documents can they see, what level of permissions do they have at a document level, at a committee level, at a book level. All of that is in Diligent Boards as well. But it really goes beyond that as well. And when we put this together, you have to kind of think about, again, what is secure, what is convenience, and how are those two things kind of intertwined. If I, for example, am an IT security director, maybe it sounds really great to me to have a really rigorous like password policy, right? A really long password, no dictionary words, capital letters, lowercase letters, special characters. That's great. No one would ever guess that password. No one would ever remember it either. So at that point, what are you seeing? You're seeing people writing their passwords on a sticky note, putting it to their device. Congratulations, you, the security director, have removed passwords from your environment. So striking this balance, right? How can we provide convenient solutions for directors, for anybody that has this level of security that you would need, but also doesn't kind of go too far, that doesn't make people kind of seek circumvention around it. So Dottie talked about this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that we do provide here is biometrics. Touch ID on iPads and iPhones. We also provide fingerprint authentication on Android devices. And this really kind of threads that needle, right? It's you don't necessarily have to remember passwords all the time. You can get in with a password. But also we do have an in-house security team who's always looking at the technology solutions that are available for security. And just to give you some background on our implementation of fingerprinting, when we looked at the technological solutions out there, we rejected several of them for not being secure enough. And in the end, only implemented Touch ID, for example, in the specific way that met our security standards. So this provides that level of convenience without really kind of going against any of Diligent's own security practices, which we can then bring to your board as well. So moving on, and I think this is a really important one. You as an organization, I think, should really recommit yourself and redouble that commitment to secure messaging, because I think this is one of the easiest ones that you can just kind of get out of sync on and just use the most convenient thing. And I think that really like the culture of like software marketing makes that so easy. Like all of the biggest products in the texting space, in the email space, have really flashy marketing, and they're designed to be really, really easy to use, really intuitive, really available, and cheap or free.
Or free and therefore not secure.
Yeah, and you have to think about what you're actually losing, right, when you go with those solutions. You're losing a ton of control over where your communications sit when they're at rest, how they're transmitted, what happens when that organization is, say, subpoenaed. And you don't have that kind of level of communication with that organization because you're using a free tool. You really just don't have that connection to them. They're fully in control of your data at that point. It's not really appropriate for enterprise level communications. So Diligent does have a product in this space, Diligent Messenger, and it's built with all of these kind of considerations in mind, built kind of for enterprise, for director level communications. So it's very secure, using the same security methodology as Diligent boards, very trusted security. It's also really intuitive to use, really convenient. So if you have a Diligent boards account, you can use that same those same permissions to get into Diligent Messenger with the same kind of biometric authentication. You can see here, available on iPhone and Android, and it looks just like any other texting app. Really, it's pretty intuitive to use. But we've also injected a lot of enterprise level kind of features that aren't really in other texting solutions. Things that are borrowed from email, for example, things like attaching multiple attachments to a single communication, so you can provide one piece of context for multiple documents. It's also available on web and on iPad, and if you use it on iPad, you can actually use it with Diligent boards side by side, and you'll be able to have these conversations with directors. Only your fellow board members and like board affiliates are going to be in Diligent Messenger, and so you're not going to risk sending it to people who aren't on your board. You'll be able to have these conversations all in the same kind of security envelope about the materials you're looking at while you're looking at them. So it's really kind of like you don't even have to think about the secure messaging at this point. It looks like all these other products, but you're not giving up control. All of your communications will always reside on Diligent servers. We pride ourselves on the availability of our staff and our customer success team. You'll always have full control of all of that, all of those communications, which I think comes in really in handy if, say, the worst happens and you're put under a litigation hold, right? You have to provide all of these communications, and your communication channel is going to be mined, right? Separating out these communications from your personal emails, from your business communications, is going to really kind of avoid any potential further avenues that investigation could go down, which even in the best case scenario is just a waste of time and resources for you.
Just kidding.
We won't even talk about the worst case scenario.
Right. Yeah, that might not be the worst.
Yeah. So I think the next thing we want to talk about here is, oversight, security oversight. The most surprising thing for us, I think, was looking at the kind of lack of oversight that happens at these kind of levels of board communications and board document security, right? And that was a little bit frightening to us to see that, but it was also kind of heartening, I think, because this is the kind of stuff we think about, having that level of security oversight. And if we're going to be maybe in some cases the only kind of security gatekeeper, that's a responsibility we take really, really seriously here. So there's a variety of things that we think about when we consider this responsibility. And one of the ones that I want to talk about, which might be it's not exactly intuitive, but this kind of idea that this idea of design as security. So there's always this push and pull between convenience and security, right? And if a product is not convenient, a time-strapped user like a director is going to try to find ways to end run around that security, putting themselves at risk, maybe not even realizing that they're doing it if they're not able to get what they need to do done quickly. So in our minds, having an intuitive, well-designed product is part of security. And to that end, we've built native apps, native versions of Diligent Boards on all major product platforms that all function in broadly the same way. So here we're looking at the iPad version of the app, but we also have a Windows 10 tablet and laptop version of the app. And we've even extended it to iPhone, Android tablets and phones, and the Mac app. And especially if you look at this, slide in particular, you can see that they all look pretty similar, and a person switching between devices would be able to move between them pretty intuitively. But they've also been slightly redesigned for every version of the product. So that's keeping in mind the kind of overall design methodology of the environment. So an Android user would find that Diligent Boards on Android is kind of more Androidy, and they'd be able to use it in an intuitive way there. But the fact that these products are intuitive and the fact that they're native allows us to implement some additional kind of security measures that we may not be able to, may not otherwise be able to implement. Things like code obfuscation, this idea that our native code can be obfuscated in such a way that reverse engineering can't be done on our product. That's a level of security that a director doesn't even have to think about. But of course, if they do run into an issue, if there is a level of frustration that would cause them to make a decision that maybe they don't have all the information for and it might mitigate their security, we have 24/7 support for every single one of our users. It's all in-house, it's all in person, and it's usually picked up within 2 rings. This resource is always available to anybody using Diligent Boards. So a director can just call in, and our support team is up to date on all modern best practices. They'll walk them through, and there's never that kind of risk of failing when it comes to security there. So I think the last thing that we want to talk about is to kind of take a step back and talk about governance processes in general and the implementation of technology to kind of make those processes more efficient, and thinking about the idea that there's right ways and wrong ways to do it, right? If you're just, if you have an existing process in place and you're taking that same process, applying a technology to it, you're not really getting bang for your buck there. You haven't really, it's kind of a lateral move. You haven't done anything at all. But if you implement the wrong solution or the right solution in the wrong way, you could introduce additional problems that you wouldn't even think about, right? So it's always tricky to kind of figure that out. And the example that I like to give here that's maybe not fully intuitive is this idea of authentication, right? The idea that when you're signing in, you know, when you're getting to your materials, use a password, use your fingerprint to get in, and you know, it's core to security, and best part, it's basically like the core of security. It's foundational. And there's also the idea of re-authentication on top of that, that every 15 minutes, 30 minutes, if you left your device idle, you have to prove who you are again. Again, that's foundational to digital security, right? It's a good process, it's best practice, and people, I think, are pretty used to it. Every 15 minutes, you know, you go get a coffee, you go have a conversation, you come back, you want to see that there. If you're in a board meeting, you've suddenly caused a problem that you probably didn't think about when you implemented your technology solution. Now you're in a meeting with the same group of people all day long, you have the same device in your hand or you're in front of it all day, you're having conversations about what's in front of you, and every 15 minutes, you have to put in a password. You've suddenly disrupted your meeting, right? And you've disrupted your meeting 4 times an hour all day long. You've disrupted the flow of your thoughts, the flow of the conversation. It is a big problem, but you would never think of it. You're just following security best practices. So again, the idea between the push and pull between security and convenience. And this is just, again, one example, but how Diligent has solved this is with what we're calling a Timeout Manager. And the Timeout Manager allows the administrator of the site to, just for the day of the meeting, move from that rigorous policy that you want for day-to-day usage and switch it to a more relaxed policy just while the meeting is going on, while everyone's in the same room, in the same office, with the same kind of level of clearance. You turn it on, you'll schedule it so it turns off automatically at the end of the meeting, and then you haven't disrupted the meeting for that day. At the end of the day, everyone goes back to how it was before. Totally convenient without really mitigating security in any way. That's the kind of solution that we have to think about at Diligent, even before we really get asked for it. That's the kind of challenge that we have to give ourselves, right, Dottie?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of the idea that we have to kind of not style ourselves into the idea of what these products were before and really push ourselves forward into becoming a real partner with directors. I think that's what we're really looking at going forward. And just to give you guys a sense of how we're thinking going forward, one of the ideas that we've been batting around here is the idea that if you're a director and you need the latest information about a topic, there's no reason that your board solution provider can't give you that information in the tool you're already using. For example, if it's a proxy season, right? Most directors would want to know, like, what do shareholders care about this proxy season, or what are the trends that are emerging? If that information is available next to the board materials you already have in the tool you already use, there's no reason, there's no reason we shouldn't do it that way.
Right.
And that's how we're looking at evolving the space. And I think it's the journey we're going to take over the next few weeks and months. And I'd be really happy for everyone to kind of follow us on that journey.
Great. Joe, thank you so much. I think that was extremely helpful. We did have a couple of questions, but I'm noticing that we are at time. That went by so quickly. So we will commit to sending out some responses in writing to the people that asked us the questions. Thank you for doing so. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Diane to just simply wrap up the conversation. Diane?
Thank you, Dottie. We want to thank you for joining us today. A replay of the webinar will be sent out to you shortly. If you have any questions or would like to see a full demonstration of diligent boards, please let us know. Again, thank you and have a great day.